everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Financially Free Physician Podcast. I'm your host, Sim Terwilliger, and today I have Meredith Jones, DVM. We're doing a crossover episode, Physicians Meet Vets. Welcome, Meredith.
Thanks, Sim. Happy to be here.
Meredith, I have a joke for you. What do physicians and vets have in common?
I don't know, Sim. What do they have in common?
They all hate non-competes. But
it's true.
You have actually a lot of experience with this as a vet, so maybe you can kind of kick us off and just give us a quick overview of what's the deal with non-competes. Why is this even a thing? Because it sounds so terrible.
Yeah, so non-competes, they're around really to mainly benefit the employer or solely benefit the employer. So it's so that they can retain staff because really the big concern in the medical field, right, is, okay, if one doctor moves from their practice to another practice, then they could take patients with them, right? They could take clients with them. And so that's the big deal, is they want to prevent that from happening. And so they say, okay, well, you've got a non-compete. It usually has a location attached to it. So it could be a certain number of miles, usually like as the crow flies. So it could be like actually more of a sweeping thing than just what it would be to just drive there. And then it usually has a time frame on it. So something like 1 year, 3 years, perhaps in some situations, if it's a really restrictive non-compete. And so yeah, that's the main thing. And then just to try to protect any trade secrets and really for the employee, there's no benefit to a non-compete, and it has the result of making doctors feel like they're trapped in their job.
And correct me if I'm wrong as a layperson, but doesn't it sound like it kind of is worse for the patients too? Because the practices are saying like, oh, we don't want you to take patients with you, but that kind of communicates that the patient can't follow their doctor if they want to.
And that can be backed up by saying, oh, well, they can't follow their doctor, but they'll kind of make excuses like, well, if it's the client's idea, then it can be okay, maybe, perhaps, depends. It's unclear, in some cases, whether you could really follow that doctor.
So let's maybe unpack a little bit then why this is such a hot topic now, because non-competes have been around kind of forever. Why is everyone talking about it again?
Well, it's something that actually the FTC has made a ruling on it pretty recently. In April, they made a ruling to ban most non-competes, and it's come up as more and more of a topic in veterinary medicine because, and I'm sure this is the case in human healthcare too, because with COVID, it kind of accentuated a lot of the staffing shortages that happened, and so it's like, okay, well, if in the veterinary world, most doctors can get they can get a job anywhere at this point because there are so many staffing shortages. And so it's like, okay, well, if I could go anywhere and get a job, why would I ever sign a non-compete?
And that's a good question. Like, why would someone sign a non-compete?
I mean, historically, it's been something that's been expected and has been required by employers, and they've just, it's been something that's been around for decades, and it's just been passed along from one practice to another. And some of the corporate hospital groups have always required it, and so it's just kind of become we've always done it this way, so we should continue to do it this way.
Yeah, it's like what do they call in behavioral finance? Status quo bias.
Yes, exactly.
It's just easier to keep it the way it was. We always did it that way. So, okay, so we have this ruling, and so now they're trying to ban the non-competes. So we have this ruling where they're trying to ban most non-competes. So what's going to happen to, all of these physicians and veterinary doctors that have signed non-competes? What happens to all of those agreements?
Well, if this goes through, and I mean, it's being contested right now, there are legal challenges, just like there are with student loans right now. There are legal challenges against this as well, against the proposed ban for non-competes.
That's shocking.
And so the pre-existing non-competes, though, if this goes through, they would be non-enforceable.
So all of these contracts that have been signed are suddenly null and void.
at least for that clause.
So do you have any insights maybe as far as what could happen with these lawsuit challenges?
The latest one that has come in was on August 20th, 2024. District Court for the Northern District of Texas blocked implementation of the FTC's rule. And they said they lacked the legal authority. And so we'll see what happens because it was set to go into effect already. It was set to go into effect on September 4th. And so right now there's no existing change. So there's been information in Facebook groups and elsewhere where people are like, "Oh, well, in September they won't be enforceable anymore." Well, that's not the case until this is battled out in the courts.
And that could presumably take months, if not years. It almost sounds like a strategy in and of itself. Let's just keep this tied up in the courts as long as we can. So, there's obviously lots of major players in this conversation right now. And so the point that you just brought up, the idea that this is not something that the FTC has power to do, that was something that was echoed by the AHA. Do you have any more insight into that?
So it's interesting because if we look at some of the professional organizations out there, the American Hospital Association, they said, okay, they don't have the authority. It's too sweeping of a change and it would exacerbate staffing shortages. On the flip side, the American Medical Association had said, well, it could actually increase access within communities to specialists. And then in veterinary medicine, the American Veterinary Medical Association, they've been called out on LinkedIn by several folks in veterinary medicine for not speaking out against non-competes. There are certain people, I won't name names, who are out there and just campaigning constantly against non-competes and giving lots of examples of bad non-competes. And AVMA has maintained a pretty neutral position. So they've got an educational page out there on what a non-compete is, and they publish articles on the latest news, and they've published articles, for example, about the FTC ban that we were just talking about, but they don't choose sides. So they'll maybe quote somebody who is against non-competes, but they're not choosing sides. And on their educational page, it actually says, while it's always good to plan, we suggest avoiding major changes as a result of the FTC rule until the final outcome is known. And who has the power to make changes? It's the employers.
So what is your take then as a vet on the AVMA? Like, do you think that they should be taking a stronger stance one way or the other?
I think it's something that would be certainly worthwhile to either have them take a stance like some of the human medical associations have, or at least have more nuanced conversations about it. And I think it's something that is ongoing that they're already doing to some extent at conferences, and so I'd like to see that expand.
Yeah, that sounds totally reasonable. So can you speak, Meredith, to your experience about like how you have been personally impacted by non-competes?
So I worked as an emergency veterinarian for a long time at an ER specialty hospital. And I initially signed, and today this would be shocking to some of the recent grads out there. I originally signed a non-compete that was 3 years and 30 miles. And so today you would probably not find that. 3 years and 30 miles. Yeah. So eventually, probably about halfway through my time working there, we had some younger doctors come in and they were able to negotiate to knock all of those down by half. And so when I left that practice, we had one that was 18 months and 15 miles, which is still a pretty good long and kind of far-reaching non-compete. And so, but I was able to get it reduced to that. And so, I mean, my experience has been that non-competes really limit what doctors can do. You go to school all those years, right? And you should be able to do the type of work that you want. You should be able to work where you want. And so non-competes, depending on, well, having one at all, or depending on how it's written, it can really limit your options. And so where I worked, I had a non-compete that it was actually restricted to just emergency medicine, but emergency medicine is all I wanted to do. And so if I wanted to be a GP, I was allowed to do that, even like across the street if I wanted to. But I wasn't able to go and work emergency elsewhere. And so when I ended up at one point thinking about leaving the practice and I interviewed elsewhere, I live in Virginia. I was interviewing in New York. I was interviewing at a place that was an hour and a half away that I wouldn't have commuted that long, and so I would have had to either of those jobs, if I had taken them, I would have had to pick up and move my family. And so, that's what doctors are faced with is, are we gonna pick up and move, or or are we gonna stay, potentially where we are in a place where we're not as happy as we could be, and so that's the dilemma that non-competes put us in. And it's kind of funny because from the employer side it's like, yeah, they want to protect their business, but do you really want doctors working at your hospital that aren't happy?
Yeah, that's such a great point. And especially in an era where burnout with physicians and vets is at an all-time high. I mean, you hear about
Mhm.
this stat a lot that like suicide amongst vets is high and getting higher. And I don't know, I'm not going to say it's because of non-competes, but I imagine that that would contribute overall to the dissatisfaction with the profession.
Certainly non-competes make life harder, not easier.
Well, I can tell you my experience as a patient, being affected by a non-compete. I had an OB that I loved, and maybe this is a kind of taking a stereotype against its head, but it was a male OB, which I know is not really popular with a lot of people, but I loved him. He was so good at his profession. I imagine that he is maybe like the kind of guy who would like be in a lecture hall when he's old, like never retire and like telling all like these new residents or attendings how to just build a meaningful practice and enjoy your patient work. He would narrate everything he was doing as he was doing it. I mean, he was the real deal. And he had some kind of outs with his partners. And when he told me this, I was like, well, I'll just follow you, no problem. Well, he had signed a non-compete that limited him to, I guess it was 2 years. So he would have to wait 2 years
Mm.
before he could open his own practice. And he was limited to a certain number of miles. But because he was practicing as an OB, he needs to be near a hospital in case one of his patients goes into labor. And so that
Mhm.
would like really limit where he could practice and where he could be. So he ended up taking a job with like the VA. So that way he could still be near his family. Well, I'm not eligible to be seen at the VA. So I lost a really good doctor. And I don't necessarily love the practice. I could maybe see why he left. And so even though the argument could be, hey, you're still with the practice, I feel like I have a lack of continuity of care as a patient because I lost someone that I had a really good rapport with. I would have been his patient for life until he retired.
That's sad, because it's like you would have stayed with them forever, and it's like you weren't allowed to. So it's like it is in that case taking away the patient or client's choice.
Yeah, because now I have to make this decision. Do I stick with the practice? Do I try to find someone new? And with the
Mhm.
specialty like OBGYN, obviously I think the rapport and the bedside manner is very important in patient
Yeah.
outcomes. I can like attest to that for myself at least. And so it's a whole thing. It's like starting over in a way.
Mhm.
So it seems like there's a lot of negatives here, but from the employer perspective, it's not like their only option is to just have a non-compete, right? It sounds like these employers have other tools at their disposal if their
Mhm.
concern is like, losing trade secrets or whatever. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So other things employers can do, they can have a non-solicitation clause instead. And so non-solicitation clause is instead of saying to the doctor, "Hey, you can't work in this particular area for this period of time," for example, what they do is they say, "Okay, well, when you leave, you can't reach out and basically advertise yourself to your patients or clients." And so it's a little bit different versus saying, hey, you can't work with these folks at all. You're just saying, okay, well, in this situation, you can't just go and outright advertise and like try to solicit your patients and clients to move over to you.
Okay, so we have non-solicitations, and then there's also non-disclosure agreements too.
I mean, in vet med, I've seen non-disclosures be more for protecting trade secrets, and occasionally there will be some. corporate employers who might have like a non-disparagement clause, don't say anything bad against the company kind of thing, related to non-disclosures. Are you aware of anything else in human medicine with non-disclosure agreements?
I imagine it would be fairly similar. I welcome any physicians listening in to comment on what your experience has been with non-disclosures. It could be, maybe something that happened. There's a lot of things it could cover.
And I want to call out a few states that have banned non-competes altogether because they are out there.
See, that's such an important thing to highlight because, here's the American Hospital Association saying the FTC like doesn't have the authority. So will they honor
Mhm.
it or are they going to have a problem with the states doing it? Because that almost seems to take their argument and flip it on its head.
So if you live in California or Oklahoma, North Dakota, and Minnesota is the latest one that has banned non-competes altogether for employees, but it usually has like a threshold. So if you make less than X, then you can't have a non-compete.
It seems like that's at least a change in the right direction, though. And I say right direction
Mhm.
because obviously on this podcast we're biased. We hate non-competes. That is our position here. So it sounds like they're taking a step in the right direction, but not fast enough. We still have to wait for these things to actually go through. And so, what can physicians and vets do right now? What should they be
Mhm.
doing right now to advocate for themselves?
Yeah, well, I always like to say the best non-compete is no non-compete. And so there are hospitals out there. I know in veterinary medicine, there are hospitals out there that don't have non-competes. And so they are not as hard to find as they used to be. There are some communities where I think it's easier to find them than others. If you can find a place with no non-compete, don't sign one. And if you can't avoid one entirely, then at least have them limit the scope, have them limit the area of practice. I've got a list of worst non-competes ever, a short list here. There are non-competes I've heard of that prohibit any other type of work. So that means like you can't even sell on Etsy. Um,
You can't
if
do
you were
anything. You can't exist.
Yeah, exactly. You can't do any other type of work than work for them.
I don't
Um,
even see how that's like legally enforceable. You can't have
right.
a livelihood unless you get it through us. That sounds like the mafia.
Right. Yeah, yeah, it's just crazy. But even within the type of medical practice, like just limiting the scope. So if you're an ER doctor and you're signing a non-compete, only sign it for emergency, right? If you want to go and work at a vaccine clinic, you should still be able to do that, right? If you want to go and work in a different area. Of course, in human medicine, it's more specialized, right? But for veterinarians, not everybody is specialized. You could work as an ER doctor and then you could go and work as a GP. If you can't limit a non-compete at all, then limit it to the shortest mile radius possible, like a half a mile or a mile. Because what they're really trying to prevent is just you going across the street and directly competing. And so it shouldn't be this like 15 or 30-mile radius. And then also the length of time, something like a year at the most.
Yeah, so spend some time negotiating before you sign it, which is
Mhm.
probably good advice for really any contract you get. Have like a contract attorney take a look at your contract. I think
Yes.
that's always a prudent idea. One thing I'll add, because I kind of am like an advocate at heart, is if, the path forward is going to be that this gets passed through the states, then I would almost encourage like anyone who hates non-competes to like reach out to your state Congress, like your state
Mhm.
government, and really ask them if the change is going to come through the state, maybe that's where you need to go and advocate that way.
And then if you live in a state, because there are several, like too many for us to name, that now have limits on non-competes depending on how much you make, then you could just ask them to expand it.
So it sounds like there's a few paths forward to make this happen, make the professions better for everyone, except maybe
Mhm.
the employer.
So a couple of other crazy non-competes that I've heard about. There was one, this was a hospital group that for their doctors in New York City, they actually had them sign a non-compete that covered all 5 boroughs of New York City.
So basically just move.
And this has been publicized on various social media. There are some residencies in veterinary medicine that if you don't, they can actually make you pay them hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so like that's a that's a very restrictive non-compete.
Yeah, it's like they own you. Wow. Yeah, these are all pretty bad. So if you don't understand it or don't like it, don't sign it.
Right. Exactly.
So I think that's all we have today for bashing non-competes. If you are a physician or vet and you like non-competes, we definitely want to hear from you because I am so curious about your viewpoint. So please comment or send us a message. Remember that your net worth is not your self-worth. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered individualized financial advice. If a specific investment is mentioned, it should not be considered a recommendation or endorsement to buy or sell the investment. You are encouraged to seek the advice of a financial professional before implementing any investment strategies discussed. All investments involve risk. Past performance does not guarantee future results.